How a spy fell in love with his terror when deception became the only truth left. There is a photograph that exists in a sealed file somewhere in Langley, Virginia. It shows two people at a cafe in Prague, their hands almost touching across a small wooden table. The woman is laughing, her head tilted back slightly, caught mid-sentence. The man across from her is smiling too, but his eyes are different, careful, measured, watching her the way a scientist watches an experiment. The photograph was taken in October 1981, through a telephoto lens from a fourth-floor window across the street. The photographer's notes, written in cramped handwriting along the margin, say only this: subject emotionally compromised. Recommend immediate extraction. The man in that photograph was known by several names, but for the purposes of this story we will call him Michael Crane, though that was not the name his mother gave him, and it was not the name on his passport when he entered Czechoslovakia that summer. Michael Crane was a ghost, a construction, a carefully designed persona built by psychologists and handlers in a windowless room at CIA headquarters. Every detail of his background had been crafted, tested, and memorized until the lie became more real than the truth. He had a childhood he never lived, a career that never existed, and a reason for being in Prague that could withstand any interrogation. But what his handlers could not prepare him for, what no training manual could account for, was the moment when the mask becomes the face, when the performance becomes the only reality left. Her name was Elena Volkov, and she worked as a translator for the Soviet embassy in Prague. She was 32 years old, unmarried, fluent in 4 languages, and according to the intelligence file that Michael had studied for 3 months before his deployment, she had access to encrypted communications between Moscow and the satellite states. She was not important enough to be heavily guarded, but important enough to know things that could save lives, shift strategies, alter the balance of power in ways that only become visible years later. She was, in the clinical language of intelligence work, a viable target for recruitment or exploitation. Michael had been chosen for this operation not because he was the most experienced agent in the field, but because the psychological profile suggested he was the right type. He was 36 years old, educated, articulate, and according to the behavioral assessment, capable of sustained emotional manipulation without significant psychological deterioration. He had been trained in what the agency called relationship-based intelligence gathering, which is a sterile way of saying he was taught how to make someone fall in love with him, how to create intimacy where none existed, how to become the answer to needs the target didn't even know they had. It was a skill that required empathy, patience, and a certain coldness at the core, the ability to feel what someone else feels without ever letting it touch you. The operation began in June 1981, on a warm evening when Prague was full of tourists and the streets smelled like roasted chestnuts and river water. Michael entered the city under the cover of being a Canadian journalist writing a book about Eastern European architecture. His credentials were flawless, his backstory airtight, and his appearance carefully calculated to be memorable but not suspicious, the kind of man you might see in a cafe and think about later, wondering who he was. He had brown hair that was just slightly too long, glasses that gave him an intellectual air, and a way of listening that made people want to talk. Elena Volkov first appeared in his life exactly as planned, at a cultural event hosted by the Embassy for Foreign Journalists. She was assigned to translate for the Soviet cultural attaché, a position that placed her in rooms where information moved like smoke, invisible but everywhere. Michael watched her from across the room that first night, noting the way she stood slightly apart from the other translators, the way her eyes scanned faces with a kind of weary intelligence. She was not beautiful in the conventional sense, but there was something about her that held attention. A sharpness, a sense that she saw more than she said. Their first conversation was brief, carefully orchestrated to seem accidental. Michael asked her about a painting on the wall, a dark landscape by a Czech artist he had researched specifically for this moment. She answered in perfect English, her voice low and precise, and for exactly 8 seconds she looked at him with something that might have been curiosity. That was all he needed. The seed was planted. 3 days later, they met again at a bookstore in the old town, and this time the conversation lasted 20 minutes. A week after that, they had coffee together, and Michael began the slow, methodical process of becoming someone she could trust. What the handlers in Langley understood, what every intelligence agency since the beginning of the Cold War had weaponized, is that human beings are wired for connection. Isolation is a kind of suffering, and in a surveillance state where everyone watches everyone else, where trust is a liability and intimacy is a risk, loneliness becomes a form of psychological starvation. Elena lived in a world where every word could be reported, every friendship could be a trap, every moment of vulnerability could be used against her. She had learned to live behind walls, to keep her thoughts private and her emotions controlled. But walls have cracks, and Michael had been trained to find them. He did not rush. That was the key. He let the relationship develop at a pace that felt natural, almost accidental, as if fate were bringing them together instead of a plan that had been designed months in advance. They talked about books, about music, about the small frustrations of daily life in a city where the light was beautiful but the air was heavy with things unsaid. He learned her rhythms, her preferences, the tiny gestures that revealed her mood. He memorized the way she smiled when she was genuinely amused versus when she was being polite, the way her voice changed when she spoke about her family, the specific kind of silence that meant she was thinking about something painful. And slowly, carefully, he became the person she felt safe with. He never asked questions that seemed too interested in her work. He never pushed for information. He simply listened, offered comfort, and created a space where she could breathe without fear. It was, in every technical sense, a perfect operation. Every conversation was reported back to his handlers through encrypted channels. Every detail was noted, analyzed, and used to refine the approach. The goal was not to extract information immediately, but to build a relationship so deep that when the moment came she would choose him over everything else: her country, her loyalty, her safety. But something happened that was not in the plan. Somewhere between the orchestrated meetings and the scripted conversations, something shifted. It began small, almost imperceptible. Michael started to anticipate their meetings not as operational objectives, but as moments he looked forward to. He found himself thinking about her when he was alone, not about what she could provide, but about the way she laughed, the way she looked at the world with a kind of sad wisdom that reminded him of something he had lost long ago. He began to notice things that had nothing to do with intelligence gathering: the way she folded her napkin after coffee, the way she touched her collarbone when she was nervous, the way her eyes softened when she talked about her grandmother who had died during the war. At first, he dismissed these thoughts as part of the performance, a necessary immersion into the role. Any good operative knows that to convince someone else, you must first convince yourself. But the line between performance and reality is thinner than people think. When you spend every day pretending to care, pretending to listen, pretending to feel, eventually the pretending becomes the truth. The mask merges with the face. The lie becomes the only honest thing left. By September they were meeting 3 times a week. They walked through the city together, visited galleries, sat in parks where the leaves were turning gold and the air smelled like rain. She told him things she had never told anyone. About her childhood in Moscow, about the brother who disappeared during the purges, about the loneliness of living in a place where everyone was afraid. And he told her his own lies, the carefully constructed stories that made up Michael Crane's life, and somewhere in the telling, he began to forget which parts were real and which parts were fiction. The handlers and Langley noticed the change before he did. The reports became less precise, more emotional. He began to omit details that seemed too personal, too intimate to share. During one debriefing over a secure line, his control officer asked him directly if he was compromised, and Michael said no, but the hesitation before the word was enough to raise flags. They reminded him of the mission parameters, the importance of maintaining operational distance, the consequences of emotional attachment. They sent him a psychological assessment questionnaire designed to detect signs of identification with the target. He filled it out and sent it back, lying on every question that mattered. In October, Elena told him she loved him. They were sitting in a small cafe near the river, the same cafe that would appear in the photograph months later, and she said it quietly, almost as if she were confessing a crime. She said it in Russian first, then in English, as if she needed to say it in both languages to make it real. Michael looked at her across the table, and for the first time since the operation began, he did not know what to say. The script in his head, the one he had rehearsed 100 times, told him to reciprocate carefully, to deepen the emotional bond, to secure the attachment that would make her vulnerable to recruitment. But what came out of his mouth was not the script. It was something raw, something unplanned. He told her he loved her too, and when he said it, he realized with a cold, sinking certainty that it was true. That night, alone in his apartment with its hidden recording devices and its encrypted communication equipment, Michael sat in the dark and understood that he had made a mistake that could not be undone. He had violated the first rule of his training: never believe your own cover. He had let the operation become real, and in doing so, he had created a situation that had no good ending. If he continued the mission, he would betray the only honest thing he had ever felt. If he abandoned the mission, he would betray his country, his duty, and the people who depended on the intelligence he was supposed to gather. Either way, someone would be destroyed. The mechanics of espionage are cold and precise, but the mechanics of the human heart are not. Michael had been trained to understand motivation, to exploit vulnerability, to use emotions as tools. But no one had trained him for the moment when those emotions became his own. He began to imagine scenarios where they could both survive: defection, extraction, disappearing together into some neutral country where neither government could reach them. But he knew these were fantasies. The CIA does not let trained operatives walk away with their secrets intact, and the KGB does not forgive translators who fall in love with Western journalists. In November, Elena began to ask questions. Not about his work but about his past. She wanted to know about his family, his childhood, the small details that make a person real. And Michael, who had memorized an entire false biography, found himself inventing new lies to cover the old ones, building layers of deception so complex that he could barely keep them straight. He told her about a father who never existed, a sister who was a fabrication, a childhood home that was just an address pulled from a map. And every lie felt like a betrayal, not of the mission but of her. She must have sensed something was wrong. People who live under surveillance develop instincts about deception. They learn to read hesitations, to notice inconsistencies, to feel when something is not quite right. One evening in late November, she asked him directly if he was who he said he was. They were walking along the river, and the question came so suddenly that he almost stopped breathing. He looked at her, and for a moment he considered telling her the truth. All of it, the operation, the lies, the fact that every moment they had shared had been designed by people in a room thousands of miles away. But instead, he did what he had been trained to do. He lied. He looked into her eyes and lied with a conviction that came from months of practice, and she believed him because she wanted to, because the alternative was too painful to accept. That was the moment when Michael understood that love and deception are not opposites. They are, in fact, almost identical. Both require you to create a version of yourself that another person can believe in. Both require you to hide the parts that are ugly, complicated, or inconvenient. Both require you to perform a kind of constant translation, turning your true self into something palatable, something safe. The only difference is intent, whether you are hiding yourself to protect the relationship or to destroy it. And sometimes even that difference disappears. December came, and with it the first real snow. The city turned white and quiet, and the handlers in Langley began to apply pressure. The operation had been running for 6 months, and there were no tangible results. Elena had not provided any classified information, had not agreed to pass documents, had not been recruited as an asset. The relationship existed, but it had not been weaponized. Michael's control officer sent him new instructions: escalate the operation, create a crisis that would force her to choose sides, or abort and extract. The message was clear. This was no longer a romance, it was a resource, and resources exist to be exploited. Michael understood what they were asking him to do. He needed to manufacture a situation where Elena would feel threatened, isolated, desperate enough to turn to him for help. Then he would offer her a way out: defection to the West, protection, a new life in exchange for everything she knew. It was a standard play, executed thousands of times during the Cold War. Create the problem, offer the solution, and in the moment of panic people will give you anything. But to do that, he would have to put her in real danger. He would have to make her believe that her own government suspected her, that she was being watched, that her life was at risk. He would have to shatter the fragile sense of safety she had built around their relationship. And once he did that, there would be no going back. Even if she agreed to defect, even if they extracted her successfully, she would spend the rest of her life knowing that the person she loved had orchestrated her destruction. On a night in mid-December, Michael sat at a small desk in his apartment and wrote 2 letters. The first was to his control officer, explaining that he was compromised, that the operation had failed, and that he was requesting immediate extraction without the asset. The second was to Elena, telling her everything: who he really was, what the operation had been, and why he could not continue. He sealed both letters and placed them side by side on the desk, staring at them for hours, unable to choose. In the end, he chose neither. Instead, he did something that no one had planned for, something that exists in intelligence files as a cautionary tale about the dangers of emotional entanglement. He told Elena part of the truth. Not all of it, not the details that would get her killed, but enough to give her a choice. He told her that he was not who he claimed to be, that he worked for people who had sent him to get close to her, and that he had failed them because he had fallen in love with her. He did not tell her he was CIA, did not reveal the specifics of the operation, but he gave her enough to understand that their relationship had begun as a lie. Her reaction was not what he expected. She did not cry, did not rage, did not walk away. Instead, she looked at him with an expression he could not read and said something that changed everything. She said she had known. Not from the beginning, but for weeks, maybe months. She said she had felt it in the way he asked questions, in the way he watched her, in the pauses that lasted just a fraction too long. She said she had stayed because she hoped that if she gave him time, the lie would become true. And it had. They sat together in silence for a long time, both of them understanding that the truth had not set them free, it had only made the cage visible. They were 2 people trapped in a system that did not allow for the complications of human emotion, that saw love as a weakness to be exploited and trust as a vulnerability to be destroyed. Michael had betrayed his country by telling her. Elena had betrayed hers by staying. And neither of them could undo what had been done. The final weeks of that winter are documented in fragments: surveillance reports, intercepted communications, debriefing transcripts that are still partially redacted. Michael did not extract. Elena did not defect. Instead, they continued meeting, but now the relationship existed in a strange, suspended state where both of them knew it was built on lies, but also knew that the feelings were real. They became co-conspirators in their own deception, pretending for the sake of the watchers that nothing had changed, while privately mourning the relationship that could never exist outside the performance. In February 1982, Michael received orders to leave Prague. The operation was officially terminated, classified as a failure due to compromised personnel. He was given 72 hours to exit the country. He met Elena one last time in the same cafe where she had first told him she loved him. They did not talk about the future because they both knew there wasn't one. They simply sat together, holding hands across the table while someone on a rooftop across the street took photographs that would later be filed away in archives marked classified. Michael left Prague on a cold morning in late February, carrying nothing but a single suitcase and the weight of a relationship that had never been his to keep. He returned to the United States, underwent a lengthy debriefing process, and was eventually reassigned to analytical work where he could not do further damage. The official record states that he retired from active service in 1985 due to psychological unsuitability for field operations. What the record does not state is that he never formed another close relationship, that he spent the rest of his career tracking information about Prague, about Soviet embassy personnel, about a translator named Elena Volkov who continued her quiet, unremarkable work until the Soviet Union collapsed and the files were scattered to the wind. Elena's fate is less clear because the archives on the Soviet side are incomplete, redacted, or simply lost. Some reports suggest she was questioned after Michael's departure, that she was moved to a different position, that she spent the rest of her career under a cloud of suspicion. Other reports suggest nothing happened at all, that the relationship was deemed harmless, that she continued her work without consequence. The truth, like everything else in this story, exists somewhere in the space between documented fact and human memory, in the place where official records fail to capture what actually occurred. But there is one more document worth mentioning, though its authenticity has never been confirmed. In 1990, after the Berlin Wall fell and the old certainties began to crumble, a letter reportedly surfaced in a collection of papers bought from a former KGB archivist. The letter was unsigned, written in English on plain paper with no identifying marks, and it was addressed to no one. It said simply this: "I think of you often and wonder if you remember the way the snow looked that winter. I wonder if you understood that I was telling the truth when I lied, and lying when I told the truth. I wonder if love is ever real or if it is always just another form of warfare, another way we destroy each other in the name of something larger than ourselves." The letter ends there, mid-thought, as if the writer could not find the words to finish. It was filed away in an archive in Moscow and later transferred to a private collection in Berlin, where it sits today among thousands of other fragments from the Cold War, pieces of lives that were lived in the shadows, stories that were never meant to be told. Whether Michael wrote that letter, whether Elena ever read it, whether it was even real or just another fabrication in a war built on fabrications, no one can say with certainty. What we know is this: intelligence agencies across the world continue to train operatives in the art of emotional manipulation. They teach them how to build relationships, how to exploit vulnerabilities, how to make someone trust them completely. They teach them the psychology of attachment, the techniques of seduction, the careful calibration of intimacy and distance. What they do not teach, what cannot be taught, is what to do when the manipulation becomes real, when the operative can no longer separate the mission from the emotion, when the tool becomes the person. The CIA calls it emotional compromise. The KGB called it personal involvement. The British services refer to it as target identification. But the clinical language masks a simpler truth: sometimes the spy falls in love. And when that happens, everyone loses: the spy, the target, the agencies that deployed them, and in a larger sense, the truth itself. Because a relationship built on deception cannot produce anything honest, even when the feelings are genuine. Every confession is suspect, every moment of intimacy is shadowed by the possibility of betrayal, every declaration of love exists in the context of lies that came before. This is the real psychological warfare that no one talks about, the one that does not involve propaganda or torture or mass manipulation. It is the warfare conducted in coffee shops and bedrooms, in quiet conversations and shared silences, in the space between two people where one of them is always performing and the other is trying desperately to believe the performance is real. It is the kind of warfare where the casualty is not the body but the soul, where the damage is not visible until years later when you realize you can no longer trust your own emotions, can no longer distinguish between what you felt and what you were supposed to feel. Michael Crane, if that was ever his real name, lived for 30 more years after Prague. He worked desk jobs, filed reports, attended meetings, and slowly became the kind of person who had once done important work in difficult places but now spent his days shuffling papers and remembering. Friends who knew him in those later years described him as quiet, private, kind in a distant sort of way. He never married, never formed close attachments, never spoke about his time in the field. When he died in 2012, his obituary was 3 lines long and mentioned only that he had worked for the federal government in an analytical capacity. No one at his funeral knew about Prague, about Elena, about the photograph that still exists in a sealed file somewhere in Virginia. But here is what that photograph does not show. It does not show the months of psychological training that went into creating Michael Crane. It does not show the handlers who monitored every conversation, who analyzed every interaction, who pushed for escalation when the operation stalled. It does not show Elena's life after Michael left, the questions she faced, the compromises she made to survive in a system that did not forgive vulnerability. It does not show the decades of silence that followed, the way both of them carried the memory of that winter like a wound that never quite healed. What the photograph shows is a single moment, frozen in time, where 2 people touched hands across a table and believed for just an instant that the lies did not matter. It shows the moment before the truth destroyed everything, before the consequences arrived, before the weight of what they had done became unbearable. It shows the last moment of the illusion, and in that sense, it is the most honest document in the entire file. Because this is what espionage does to human beings. It takes the things that make us vulnerable, our need for connection, our capacity for trust, our desire to be known by another person, and turns them into weapons. It teaches us to perform intimacy without feeling it, to manufacture emotion without experiencing it, to destroy people through the very mechanisms that should bring us together. And sometimes, it teaches us too well. Sometimes the operative becomes so skilled at the performance that they forget they are performing. Sometimes the mask becomes the face, and the lie becomes the only truth available. There is a theory in psychology called cognitive dissonance, which describes the discomfort that occurs when a person holds 2 contradictory beliefs simultaneously. The human mind, when faced with this kind of contradiction, will work desperately to resolve it, either by changing one of the beliefs by adding new beliefs to justify the contradiction, or by simply refusing to acknowledge that the contradiction exists. Michael experienced all 3. He told himself the operation was justified, that it was necessary, that the intelligence gathered would save lives. He told himself that his feelings for Elena were part of the cover, that they were tools he was using to achieve a goal. And when those explanations stopped working, he simply stopped thinking about it at all, burying the contradiction so deep that it became part of his foundation, a fracture that ran through everything he built afterwards. This is the hidden cost of psychological warfare, the damage that never appears in budget reports or casualty figures. It is the cost paid by the operatives who execute these missions, who are asked to weaponize their own humanity and then somehow remain human. It is the cost paid by the targets, who learn that trust is dangerous, that intimacy is a trap, that the people who claim to love them might be dismantling them from the inside. And it is the cost paid by everyone who lives in a world where this kind of warfare is normalized, where relationships are strategic resources and emotions are tactical advantages. The Cold War ended more than 30 years ago, but the techniques developed during that era are still in use. Intelligence agencies still recruit operatives who can build relationships, still train them in the art of emotional manipulation, still deploy them into situations where love becomes a weapon. The technology has changed, the targets have shifted, the geopolitical landscape is different, but the fundamental strategy remains the same. Find the vulnerability, exploit it, and walk away before the damage becomes visible. And sometimes, just sometimes, the operative does not walk away. Sometimes they stay in the wreckage they created, trying to salvage something real from the debris of lies. Sometimes they spend the rest of their lives wondering if anything they felt was genuine, or if they were just so good at the performance that they fooled themselves. Sometimes they realize that the line between love and manipulation is so thin that crossing it is almost inevitable, and once crossed, there is no way to know which side you are on. The file on Operation Songbird, which was the operational code name for Michael's mission in Prague, remains classified. The few details that have emerged over the years come from redacted documents, anonymous sources, and the kind of whispered stories that circulate in intelligence communities where secrecy is both a professional requirement and a personal habit. But classified or not, the story exists. It exists in the memories of the people who planned it, executed it, and tried to forget it. It exists in the archives where photographs and reports and intercepted letters gather dust. And it exists in the lives of two people who discovered that the most effective deception is the one you practice on yourself. There is a question that haunts every story like this, a question that has no satisfying answer. Was it worth it? Did the operation produce intelligence valuable enough to justify the human cost? Did Michael's betrayal of Elena and Elena's betrayal of herself, and both of their betrayals of the truth, serve some greater good that makes the damage acceptable? The official answer, the one given in debriefings and after-action reports, is always the same. Intelligence work requires difficult choices, and operatives are expected to make personal sacrifices for national security. But that answer assumes that the damage is limited, that it affects only the individuals involved, that it can be contained and managed like any other operational risk. The truth is messier. The damage spreads. Michael returned to the United States carrying the weight of what he had done, and that weight influenced every decision he made afterwards, every relationship he avoided, every moment of connection he sabotaged before it could become real. Elena stayed in Prague carrying her own weight, and though we cannot know the details of her life after Michael left, we can imagine the ways that betrayal reshaped her, the ways she learned to protect herself by never trusting anyone fully again. And beyond them, there are the other operatives who read the classified reports, who learned from Michael's mistakes, who trained themselves to be colder, more distant, more effective at the kind of emotional manipulation that destroys people from the inside. This is how psychological warfare works. It does not end when the operation concludes. It echoes forward, creating patterns of behavior that replicate themselves across generations. The operative who was betrayed becomes the handler who teaches the next generation to betray more effectively. The target who was manipulated becomes more suspicious, more guarded, more likely to see deception even where none exists. And the systems that deploy these tactics become more sophisticated, more ruthless, more willing to sacrifice the humanity of their own people in the pursuit of strategic advantage. So when we talk about how a spy fell in love with his target, we are not really talking about a love story. We are talking about the moment when a weapon misfires, when a tool breaks in the hand that wields it, when the mechanisms of control produce the opposite of their intended effect. We are talking about the failure that is baked into the strategy itself, the inevitable moment when human emotion refuses to be managed, manipulated, or erased. And we are talking about the cost of pretending that emotion can be weaponized without consequence, that people can be treated as resources without becoming damaged, that love and deception can coexist in the same space without destroying each other. The photograph in the file shows two people at a cafe in Prague, their hands almost touching, both of them smiling. But if you look closely, if you know what you are seeing, you can detect the performance in their postures, the calculation in their expressions. You can see the way Michael is angled slightly toward the camera, as if part of him is always aware of being watched. You can see the way Elena's smile does not quite reach her eyes, as if part of her is already protecting herself from what comes next. You can see, in that frozen moment, the shadow of everything that will follow. The betrayal, the extraction, the decades of silence, the lives spent wondering what was real. That is the real document, the one that matters more than any classified report or debriefing transcript. It is the evidence that human beings cannot be reduced to strategic assets, that emotions cannot be deployed without consequences, that the attempt to control the human heart through deception always, eventually, fails. Not because the operatives are not skilled enough or because the tactics are not refined enough, but because the strategy itself is built on a fundamental misunderstanding of what it means to be human. We are not machines that can be programmed and reprogrammed without leaving traces. We are not tools that can be used and discarded without damage. We are fragile, contradictory, desperately social creatures who need connection the way we need air, and when that need is exploited, when intimacy becomes weaponized, when trust becomes a tactical resource, something essential breaks. It breaks in the operative, it breaks in the target, and it breaks in the world they both inhabit. This is the archive that was never meant to be opened, the file that was sealed not because it contains state secrets, but because it contains a truth that intelligence agencies would prefer to keep hidden. That psychological warfare is not a clean, surgical instrument that can be deployed without collateral damage. It is a blunt trauma that destroys everyone it touches, including the people who wield it. And the damage does not stay contained in classified files or redacted documents. It spreads outward, infecting relationships and institutions, teaching entire generations that trust is dangerous, that intimacy is a vulnerability, that the safest way to live is to never let anyone close enough to hurt you. Michael Crane learned that lesson, and it killed him slowly over 30 years. Elena Volkov learned it too, in whatever life she built after that winter in Prague. And everyone who reads this story learns it again, a little bit, as the details sink in and the implications become clear. We learn that love can be faked, that intimacy can be manufactured, that the people who seem to care about us might be destroying us with surgical precision. We learn to protect ourselves, to hold back, to never quite believe that connection is real. This is what the Cold War left behind. Not just the geopolitical realignment or the economic systems or the nuclear arsenals, but the deep, psychological understanding that human emotion can be weaponized, that trust can be exploited, that the things we need most desperately can be used to destroy us most effectively. And that understanding has outlived the political systems that created it, has spread far beyond the intelligence agencies that perfected it, has become woven into the fabric of how we relate to each other. Look around and you can see it everywhere. In the way we perform ourselves on social media, carefully curating an image designed to manipulate perception. In the way dating has become gamified, reduced to strategic decisions about when to text and what to say. In the way corporations use psychological research to manufacture desire and loyalty. In the way political movements exploit emotional vulnerabilities to radicalize and mobilize. The techniques developed by intelligence agencies during the Cold War have metastasized into the general culture, becoming the default way we approach relationships, identity, and truth. And at the center of it all is the same question that Michael faced in that cafe in Prague. Can anything be real when everything is a performance? Can love exist when it was born from deception? Can trust be rebuilt after betrayal? The answer that intelligence agencies give is no, which is why they consider emotional compromise a failure, why they extract operatives who fall in love, why they train the next generation to be colder and more distant. But the real answer is more complicated because human beings are more complicated. Sometimes love survives deception. Sometimes trust rebuilds after betrayal. Sometimes people find a way to forgive the lies and hold on to whatever truth emerged from the wreckage. But it requires both people to choose vulnerability over safety, to risk being hurt again, to accept that the relationship will always carry the scars of how it began. And it requires them to acknowledge that love and manipulation are not opposites but neighbors, that every intimate relationship requires some degree of performance, that the line between honest connection and strategic deception is thinner than anyone wants to admit. Michael and Elena did not get that chance. The systems they lived within did not allow for the complications of human emotion, for the possibility that something real could emerge from something fake. They were pulled apart by forces larger than themselves, by national security concerns and operational requirements and the simple, brutal logic that says operatives cannot be trusted after they become emotionally compromised. And so they disappeared into separate lives, carrying with them the memory of a relationship that was both the most honest and the most dishonest thing either of them had ever experienced. The photograph remains in the file, a frozen moment that captures everything and nothing. It captures the surface, two people at a cafe smiling, their hands almost touching. But it misses the depth, the training that made that moment possible, the lies that created the context, the institutional machinery that produced the entire scenario. It misses the years that came before, when Michael was learning how to manipulate emotion, and the years that came after, when both of them tried to understand what they had done to each other. It misses the essential truth that every surveillance photograph misses. That human beings are not just the sum of their visible actions, that the most important things happen in the space between people, in the silences and hesitations and moments of genuine feeling that no camera can capture. If you could interview Michael Crane today, if he were still alive to answer questions about Prague, about Elena, about the operation that destroyed them both, he would probably say nothing. That is what operatives are trained to do, even decades after retirement, even when the Cold War is over and the files are being unsealed. They stay silent because silence is the only loyalty they have left, the only part of the mission they can still execute. But silence is also a kind of answer. It is the acknowledgement that some stories cannot be told without causing more damage, that some truths are too complicated to reduce to words, that some experiences live in a space beyond language where all you can do is carry them until you die. There are therapists who specialize in treating former intelligence operatives, psychologists who have security clearance and understand the specific kinds of trauma that come from living a double life. They describe a condition that has no official diagnosis, a form of dissociation where the operative loses track of which version of themselves is real. They forget the cover story but also forget the truth beneath it. They become a collection of performances with no stable center, no core identity they can return to when the mission ends. Some operatives recover, learning slowly to integrate the fractured pieces of their personality. Others never do. They spend the rest of their lives moving through the world like ghosts, present but not quite real, watching themselves from a distance that never closes. Michael was probably one of the ones who never recovered. The evidence suggests as much. The isolated life, the absence of relationships, the decades of silence. He became what the operation made him. A person capable of deep connection who could no longer trust that any connection was genuine. He learned too well the lesson that intimacy can be manufactured, and in learning it, he destroyed his own capacity for the real thing. That is the final irony, the last twist in a story built entirely on contradictions. By becoming skilled enough to make Elena fall in love with a fiction, he made himself incapable of believing that anyone could love the truth. In the end, that is the only truth that matters. Not whether the operation succeeded or failed, not whether Michael was compromised or Elena was recruited, not whether the intelligence gathered justified the methods used. The truth is simpler and more devastating. Two people met in a city where nothing was as it seemed, built a relationship on a foundation of lies, discovered that their feelings were real despite the deception, and then were torn apart by systems that could not accommodate the complexity of human emotion. And both of them spent the rest of their lives carrying the weight of that experience, trying to understand what had been real and what had been performance, wondering if genuine connection is even possible in a world where intimacy can be manufactured on command. That is the story. That is the archive. That is what remains when you strip away the operational codenames and strategic justifications and bureaucratic language. It is a story about two people who fell in love in circumstances designed to make love impossible, who discovered that authenticity and deception can coexist in the same moment, who learned that the human heart cannot be controlled no matter how sophisticated the training or how precise the operational plan. It is a story that has been repeated thousands of times throughout history, in every intelligence service, in every conflict, wherever nations decide that the strategic value of information justifies the personal cost of obtaining it. And it will be repeated again. Tomorrow, next week, next year, operatives will be deployed on missions that require them to build relationships with targets. Some will maintain operational distance. Some will complete their assignments and extract without significant psychological damage. But some will fall in love, will cross the line from performance to reality, will discover too late that they have destroyed themselves in the process of trying to destroy someone else. And when that happens, new photographs will be taken, new files will be created, new lessons will be learned and promptly forgotten because the system cannot function if it fully acknowledges the cost of its own operations. This is psychological warfare at its most intimate and most devastating. Not propaganda broadcast to millions, not torture conducted in secret prisons, not brainwashing experiments run on unwilling subjects. Just two people at a cafe holding hands, both of them lying, both of them telling the truth, both of them destroyed by the contradiction. This is the weapon that leaves no mark except on the soul, the violence that cannot be documented because it happens in the space between heartbeats, the warfare conducted in whispers and silences and moments of false intimacy that somehow become real. The file remains classified. The photograph remains sealed. The names have been changed to protect people who are already dead. But the truth persists, carried forward by everyone who has heard this story, everyone who recognizes the pattern, everyone who understands that love and deception are not opposites but variations of the same fundamental human capacity for connection. We are all, in some sense, both Michael and Elena, both deceiver and deceived, both performer and audience in the theater of human relationships. We all construct versions of ourselves to present to others. We all hide our true thoughts behind careful performances. We all manipulate and are manipulated in the complex dance of intimacy. The difference is that most of us do not do it as a weapon. Most of us do not have handlers monitoring our relationships, analyzing our attachments, calculating the strategic value of our emotions. Most of us are not trained to exploit vulnerability with surgical precision, to manufacture trust as a means to betrayal, to destroy people through the very mechanisms that should bring us together. Most of us are just trying to connect, to be known, to find some small corner of authenticity in a world that demands constant performance. But we live in the shadow of operations like Michael's, in a world shaped by the understanding that intimacy can be weaponized, that trust is dangerous, that emotional vulnerability is a risk to be managed rather than a gift to be offered. We have learned the lessons that the Cold War taught, absorbed them so thoroughly that they seem natural, inevitable, just the way things are. And in learning those lessons, we have made ourselves smaller, more defended, less capable of the kind of radical openness that authentic connection requires. This is the final casualty of psychological warfare. Not just the operatives who conduct it or the targets who suffer it, but all of us who live in its aftermath, who have inherited a world where manipulation is normalized and trust is naive and love is always shadowed by the possibility of betrayal. We are all walking wounded from a war we did not know we were fighting, carrying damage we cannot quite name from operations that were never meant to be revealed. So when you see a photograph of two people at a cafe, hands almost touching, both of them smiling, ask yourself what you are really seeing. Ask yourself what lies beneath the surface, what invisible forces are shaping that moment, what costs are being paid for what benefits. Ask yourself if love can survive when it is born from deception, if trust can be rebuilt after betrayal, if authenticity is even possible in a world where we are all performing versions of ourselves that we hope will be accepted, loved, believed. The answer is uncertain. Maybe it can, maybe it cannot. Maybe Michael and Elena found something real despite the lies, or maybe they only found another layer of deception. Maybe we are all capable of genuine connection despite living in a world that teaches us to weaponize intimacy, or maybe we have already been compromised so thoroughly that authenticity is no longer available to us. The only certainty is that the question matters, that the struggle to connect authentically despite all the forces that push us toward performance and deception is the defining challenge of human existence. And that is where this archive ends, not with answers but with questions, not with resolution but with the recognition that some stories cannot be resolved because they touch on contradictions too fundamental to eliminate. Michael and Elena's story is one of those irreducible contradictions, a case study in what happens when love and warfare occupy the same space, when the tools of connection become weapons of destruction, when the very things that make us human are turned against us in the service of strategic objectives we barely understand. The file closes. The photograph fades. The names disappear into history. But the questions remain, echoing forward through time, asking each of us to consider what we would do in that cafe in that moment with those impossible choices. Would we choose duty or emotion? Would we maintain operational distance or fall in love? Would we sacrifice ourselves to protect the mission, or sacrifice the mission to remain human? And if we made the wrong choice, would we spend the rest of our lives wondering if there was ever a right one? These are not abstract questions. They are the questions that every person faces when they are asked to choose between connection and safety, between authenticity and acceptance, between revealing their true self and maintaining the performance that protects them. They are the questions at the heart of every intimate relationship, every act of trust, every moment of vulnerability. And they are questions without easy answers, because the world we inhabit was shaped by operations like Michael's, by a history of psychological warfare that taught us to see intimacy as risk and trust as vulnerability and love as a potential weapon. If you've listened this far, if you've followed this story from the cafe in Prague to its scattered conclusion across decades and continents, then you already know too much. You know that the people who claim to protect us sometimes destroy us in the process. You know that institutions built on strategic calculation have no room for the messy complications of human emotion. You know that love can be manufactured, trust can be weaponized, and the line between genuine connection and skilled manipulation is so thin that even the people involved cannot always distinguish between them. You know, in other words, what the handlers in Langley tried to hide, what the redacted files were meant to conceal, what the classified archives will never fully reveal. That psychological warfare is not something that happens in distant countries to other people in extraordinary circumstances. It is something that shapes all of us, that has infected the way we relate to each other, that has made us suspicious of our own emotions and skeptical of others' intentions and deeply, fundamentally uncertain about whether authentic connection is even possible anymore. That is the real archive, the one that exists not in filing cabinets in Virginia but in the collective memory of a culture that learned to weaponize intimacy and never forgot how. That is the real casualty count, not the operatives who were compromised or the targets who were betrayed, but all of us who learned their lessons and made them our own. And that is the real warfare, the one that continues long after the Cold War ended, the one that happens every time we choose safety over vulnerability, performance over authenticity, careful distance over risky connection. Subscribe to War Archives Black if you dare to know more. Like this video if you felt the echo of these truths in your own life. And remember, as you close this window and return to your carefully curated existence, that silence is not peace. It is simply the absence of confession. The warfare continues, invisible but everywhere, in every relationship that never quite becomes real, in every emotion that is felt but not expressed, in every moment when we choose the lie over the truth because the truth is too dangerous to reveal. The archive remains open. The questions persist. And somewhere in a file that will never be declassified, a photograph shows two people at a cafe, their hands almost touching, both of them smiling, both of them trapped in a performance that became indistinguishable from life itself. They are still there, frozen in that moment, waiting for someone to understand what they were trying to say beneath the words, what they were feeling beneath the performance, what they sacrificed in the space between duty and desire. That is the story of how a spy fell in love with his target. But really, it is the story of how we all became both spy and target, both deceiver and deceived, both victim and perpetrator in a war fought not with weapons but with words, not on battlefields but in bedrooms, not between nations but between human hearts that wanted to connect but learned instead to protect themselves at any cost. The cost was everything. The cost is still being paid. And the warfare never ends because the battlefield is wherever two people meet and try to decide whether trust is possible, whether love is real, whether the person across the table is showing you their truth or just another carefully crafted performance designed to make you vulnerable enough to destroy. Welcome to the archive. You are already part of it,